I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Rachel Bovard.
Now I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. We have a great show lined up for you today. We're going to start with the big news, not just of this week, but of really the month, and it could be the biggest news of the year. Josh is going to talk to us and talk us through new developments in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We're going to then transition to Ben, who's going to talk about Biden ending anti-espionage in China initiative. We're going to talk about the fake unity message in the State of the Union, or I should say the fake moderate message in the State of the Union. I'll be tackling that. And then we're going to kick it over to Rachel, who's talking about how Rick Scott has stepped into the leadership breach on the Republican side. So let's start with Josh.
Okay, so thank you, Emily. So this has been the story of seemingly the past month. I mean, certainly the past story of the past week and a half, 2 weeks, obviously since Putin gave what can only be described as kind of a harrowing kind of Cold War-esque speech and then sent the troops marching into the Donbass. And as we're recording this, it seems like the Russian troops have basically surrounded the Ukrainian capital of Kiev or however we're pronouncing it these days. And the Ukrainian parliamentarians seem to be unable to flee. This is a well-informed audience. Obviously, we don't need to give you kind of a play-by-play as to how this is playing out here. I think there's kind of just like a few kind of top-line talking or areas for discussion to kind of tease out here. The first is probably more so than I think any event in my kind of adult life, or certainly any event since I've kind of entered the broader realm of commentary, talking head, punditry, all that stuff. It is extraordinarily hard to try to figure out what is actually happening here. There is just so much misinformation out there on social media, on cable news. There is so much kind of propaganda out there. And there's obviously, Russian propaganda is obviously quite infamous. The Russian propaganda obviously played a massive role in both the 2016 and 2020 elections, but that's not to say that there is no shortage of Ukrainian propaganda as well. Obviously, I think the Ukrainian government knows that they are kind of able to play kind of Western elites and kind of easily duped kind of Westerners in general, kind of like a fiddle. We're seeing a lot of that going on as well. So it's very, very, very hard to kind of try and separate what is actually happening from what is being reported. Certainly, some of these images, these graphics, these videos that we're seeing are unambiguously true. I mean, they don't seem to be doctored, at least I should say. And a lot of these images are terrible, obviously. I mean, the refugee crisis, the humanitarian crisis that Putin's invasion is creating is abominable. I mean, we're talking about over 500,000 Ukrainians fleeing. Last time I checked, I think Poland is taking in a plurality, perhaps even an outright majority of them. But Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Moldova, a lot of the countries in the region obviously are having to deal with this refugee crisis that Putin's invasion has precipitated here. So look, I did a long tweet thread on this on Sunday, kind of giving my basic synopsis as to what is going on here. I think most people are getting this story wrong. Obviously, on kind of like the far left, obviously kind of the organs of the mainstream media, and certainly kind of like the shills for kind of like generic bland right liberalism, your David French's, Jonah Goldbergs of the world. There's on both of those sides has been kind of this stark moral dichotomy posed between kind of revanchist Putin, Russian imperialism versus Ukraine as this kind of bastion of liberal democracy. And on the other hand, on kind of the, the extreme fringes, I'm like truly fringes here, right? I mean, like the Nick Fuentes crap that we saw in that video on Friday, there is there was a very, very small segment that on the American right and maybe even on the left, I don't know, that is avowedly kind of pro-Putin. Look, two things can be true at once here, okay? Ukraine is not a bastion of liberal democracy. It is one of the most profoundly corrupt and oligarchic countries in the world in its own right. It is by orders of magnitude, based on what I've seen, probably the poorest country in all of Europe. I think Moldova is fairly close, but it is certainly the poorest. It is profoundly corrupt, as anyone with even kind of a cursory knowledge of Joe Biden and Burisma and all of that would be able to tell you. As recently as the 2014 revolution in Ukraine, I think it was literally actually the number one most corrupt country in the world on one ranking that I saw. So it is Ukraine, even relative to some of its kind of Central and Eastern European neighbors. I mean, like Poland or Hungary, for example, it's just simply not as developed. Okay, these two things are not in common here. At the same time, it seems very obvious to me from an American perspective that we should not be obviously, I feel so silly I have to say this, but we should not be rooting for Vladimir Putin. Okay, like this is a man who literally came through the ranks as a KGB thug. He was literally serving in a KGB office in East Berlin at the time of the fall of communism, when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. At the same time here, I mean, Vladimir Zelensky, I mean, his ammunition, not a ride line, obviously, was the stuff of legends. We should applaud that, obviously. I mean, it was quite courageous here. But I mean, it's not like Western liberal democracy is on the line here necessarily either. And what I really fear from kind of like a NatCon national conservatism perspective in particular here, maybe this is kind of where I'll open up for discussion. What I fear is that this story in particular is going to lead to kind of like the zombie rise from the dead, if you will, of kind of like Hillary Clinton, Samantha Power-esque liberal internationalism. Like, if we let this narrative to truly get out there, that this is just brute imperialism versus Western liberal democracy, and we kind of let this kind of stark moral dichotomy get out there, I think that narrative, if it picks up steam, if it kind of steamrolls, could be a bad, an inauspicious trend for kind of NatCons in general here. And I think that is true, while simultaneously we should be taking prudential, reasonable means to support Ukraine. Those are not in tension with one another. So it's a nuanced, kind of delicate balancing act, but I'd be curious if anyone disagrees or has anything to add.
I mean, I almost think we're at that point where, what this invasion has given us, what Russia has given the West, is a reason for the neocons to become relevant again. And they will be beating this drum for the foreseeable future. I think this was a huge setback for anyone who, wanted to have the national interest conversation. I think that's for two reasons. One, just, and maybe this is the first and foremost reason, it seems, every time something like this happens, and I don't want to be flippant about what's happening because I think it is terrible, and the images coming out of Ukraine are terrible. And, the children and women that are being subject to this, as they are in every conflict, is just horrific to watch. But it's almost like America goes through this like fever, about having to do something immediately. And it's not always just defense spending, although I'm going to get to that in a second. But it's like, I keep thinking back to that post 9/11 moment where, remember when France wouldn't join our coalition? So we started calling French fries freedom fries. It's like the same impulse that makes everybody dump out their Russian vodka, and like not show the Russian flag on like in sporting events. It's like we have to almost like have this national catharsis about, that everything is terrible. But I do think sometimes that propels our policy response, because you're not having a reason to policy debate at that point. You're calling everyone who disagrees with you a traitor. If you remember in the wake of 9/11, Bill Maher was actually fired for saying that the hijackers believed in something, right? That it wasn't the right thing to believe in, but it was courageous what they did. He was fired from ABC News for saying that. We had to boycott the Dixie Chicks because they questioned the Iraq War. Like, there's this very binary mentality that comes down on the country. And I think, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I think it's just a thing that happens every time. And when it informs our policy response, that's when you, instead of having a conversation about the national interest, you start having a conversation about who's on your team and who's not, who's for Russia, and who's not. And I think you're seeing that on Capitol Hill already, where the White House has asked for $6.4 billion in Ukraine supplemental. From what I was hearing this morning, that's already up to $10 billion. And that's not from the White House, that's from Congress. In addition to the $1 billion we've already sent in security assistance, the $54 million in humanitarian aid. So I do think going forward that this is, the hawks have risen again, and they will use that binary ideological framing, I think, to their benefit from now on, as long as it lasts.
All right, I'm going to try to limit my remarks because we could obviously spend multiple episodes on this topic, and I think there are a lot of threads worth pulling at. If I had to, well, let me just say that I think we have not even talked about, like, as a nation, our purported leaders, what is the end game here? What is in America's national interest? What are you willing to risk to achieve it? What's the best cost benefit analysis that you can put forward to get there? The reactions have been much more reflexive. The simplistic framing, to your point, Josh, of this is liberal democracy versus authoritarianism, I think doesn't at all capture the nuance in it, nor does it capture what America's role has been with respect to both Ukraine and Russia for years preceding what has transpired. I also just want to point out that this notion, I'm not even sure why it's being injected except for propaganda purposes, that Vladimir Putin's gone insane, wants to put together again the Soviet empire. I think it flies in the face of the rhetoric and the reality that he felt that this was the time to try to strike and achieve something that where there's an asymmetric payoff. This is a far more important strategic situation for Vladimir Putin than it is for us. And consequently, with a weak US leader in power, he thought that now was the time to strike. Setting all of that aside, and we can go through all these nuances, I just want to point out that if there's one word to describe what I've seen on the national scene, it's disingenuousness. It's so disingenuous for the administration to be acting like during the State of the Union, almost as if the US had triumphed in this situation. If you were actually serious with respect to Ukraine, the first thing that you would do is flood the market with oil, take off all the restrictions possible to unleash American energy and break us of our dependence with Russia. Of course, that has not happened. And of course, you would sanction all of the Russian oil companies and you would cut them off from the international banking system and all the rest of it immediately. But obviously, they have not done that. They fear doing so. And let's not forget that at the very time this is going on, Russia is a critical partner, as they were last time around, in helping the Biden administration negotiate an Iran deal 2.0, so that Iran can then flood the market with oil and refill its coffers. Iran, of course, being a partner of Russia. China, of course, is also circling here. They see this as an opportunity to exploit, to try to play the role of interlocutor, peacemaker, mediator, and advance their interests as well. So I think all of these broader strategic points ought to be put in play here. But I also just think it's completely disingenuous to say you're 100% behind Ukraine, et cetera. But then the most important thing of all, energy, the lifeblood in effect of Putin's regime, was basically taken off the table from the start in all this. So I think it's fake. And I think the other sad point worth making, to Josh's point, we don't know what the reality is of the situation, is that we now are in a situation, an information environment where we really can't trust what any authorities say. And so it's very hard to assess what's going on and what the right plays are strategically, given that vacuum that's been created by people who have destroyed our trust in them with their propagandizing over the last 5+ years.
I think we're out of time, but I'll just add that I'm not as black-pilled as Rachel about the rise of the hawks, or I'm not as cynical, to put it in normal language, about the rise of the hawks as Rachel is, because I think we've seen, Blake Masters put out an excellent tweet thread on the situation in Ukraine that was nuanced and balanced and very helpful. And I do think we've seen some tempering of those old neoconservative instincts in the Republican Party, even the reality that we haven't, yes, we've increased spending and everything in Ukraine, and we have given a lot of assistance. And I think, much of that is rightfully where it is rightfully allocated. But at the same time, I do think there has been some tempering in this whole conversation, and that's really for the better. That's a good, I'm just glad to see that a nuanced conversation has emerged outside of the sort of mainstream channels. So with that, I think I'm kicking it back to you, Ben, to talk to us about the anti-espionage initiative in China that has been canceled.
Yeah, so of course, on the eve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, one day before, the Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department's National Security Division announced at a speech in front of George Mason University's National Security Institute that the Biden administration would be terminating its China initiative. The China initiative was launched under the Trump DOJ as part of its comprehensive strategy to counter the Chinese Communist Party, with a focus on basically the whole panoply of threats that the Chinese government poses to the US homeland, with a particular focus on combating economic espionage, intellectual property theft, stealing of strategically significant research, and the like on the US homeland. And so this led to dozens of cases being brought under this initiative, most notably the pursuit of a former chair of, I think, a chemistry and biology department at Harvard University, Charles Lieber, the pursuit of the CFO of Huawei on charges, including conspiracy charges, bank fraud charges, et cetera, relating to work that Huawei did with Iran and other sanctioned countries, and a whole slew of other cases as well since that initiative started in 2018. From the very start of the Biden administration, it's worth noting, and even before actually the inauguration, progressive activist groups, Asian identity-focused activist groups as well, with a left-wing tinge, as well as academics, began lobbying the Biden administration quite hard to review this initiative and kill this initiative, along with a whole slew of other demands, including demands that ultimately led to, as I covered for Newsweek for Josh early on in the administration, the effort to put in place an executive order barring the use of terms like Chinese coronavirus, because they're perceived for the executive agencies to use those terms as being anti-Asian, and of course, creating an anti-Asian backlash nationally, which they've tried to tie that rhetoric to hate crimes against Asians in America. So ultimately, under pressure from woke activists and academics, the administration caved. And the Assistant Attorney General acknowledged this in his remarks at George Mason. He said two things. He said, one, we've heard concerns from the civil rights community that the China initiative fueled a narrative of intolerance and bias. And he also said, we've heard these prosecutions and the public narrative they create can lead to a chilling atmosphere for scientists and scholars that damages the scientific enterprise in this country. Those were the two stated rationales by the Assistant Attorney General for killing this initiative. And what he said was basically, we're going to kill this initiative and we're going to focus on the whole slew of threats, multifaceted threats, not just from China, but a whole slew of nation state actors under a brand new strategy. Implication being China is not the number one threat, clearly, because otherwise you would maintain a China specific initiative. And also that there would likely, of course, be a commensurate reallocation of DOJ resources towards pursuing all of these other threats, not China as the number one threat. But it's worth noting that it wasn't just woke activists and academics who were the ones lobbying to kill this initiative. It was also the Chinese Communist Party itself. And the foreign ministry spokeswoman for the Chinese Communist Party was asked a question about this the day after the termination of the initiative and said that we had issued something like solemn representations, is the word they used, calling for the US government to kill this initiative from its very beginning. To me, the main takeaway from this story, beyond the substance of the fact that if the DOJ is not going to pursue these cases, it's obviously hugely detrimental to our national security. At the very same time, by the way, that the DOJ, as I've noted before, is opening a new domestic terror unit to pursue US citizens while it backs off of China. And this flies in the face, of course, of the so-called tough on China Joe Biden administration. But the other aspect is that the woke activists and academics had a veto over national security on this issue. We subordinated national security interests to political correctness here. I think that it's utterly cataclysmic. And when you look at now the focus on Russia over the focus on China, I think this foretells very, very bad things for the country for the next few years. I'm curious how you all see the termination of this initiative, what you think the consequences might be.
I mean, we're fundamentally unserious, right? Like we talk about like the pervasive wokeness that impacts our military and our, intelligence community. And it's all kind of funny, right? Like, haha, that they actually spent money on these initiatives. But no, this is actually impacting our national security. The fact that we cannot, we have a known problem with Chinese espionage, but we cannot actually go after it because that might be racist. Like, that is just the most backwards thing I've ever heard in my life. And it speaks volumes about where we are as a country. And it kind of just ties back into the Ukraine conversation we just had, because yes, what threatening power would look at us and be like, they are at the top of their game. All you have to do is call something racist and it removes a tool by which, it can be exploited by hostile regimes. Like, come on, this is just a joke. This has to be a joke.
Well, and that's why, you have Biden talking about, he spent, I don't know, a couple sentences on China in his State of the Union address, which we'll get to in a moment. But it's a good example of how easy it is to signal things, superficially signal things, and win your sort of political points and cover your butt. And then your vast administrative state and your giant, bureaucracy is doing all kinds of different things downstream of what you might be saying publicly. And so, and Trump kind of talked about this all the time, about how there's such a huge difference in rhetoric and action, and how he might, use rhetoric to, bring Putin to a negotiating table or bring whatever world leader to a negotiating table. I mean, he was fairly tough on both Russia and China and was actually fairly friendly with their leaders in those public settings, even beyond what I was comfortable with. And so it's a good example, though, that you can say one thing and do things nobody is ever going to hear about because they're not going to get coverage, and they're just sort of through the bureaucracy. And that's a really sad state of affairs.
Yeah, look, I mean, lurking in the entire background of the Russia-Ukraine story, which obviously is very much like the story of the week and the month, is Xi Jinping and Taiwan and China, obviously, right? I mean, I have given a lot of thought over the past week or two. As someone who has been to Taiwan, or excuse me, has been to Hong Kong, who saw Hong Kong back in 2016. We did nothing. I mean, the United States, I obviously would never call for boots on the ground in Hong Kong, for goodness sake, but what did we do last year when the Chinese Communist Party, I mean, effectively, I'm exaggerating slightly here, but they effectively kind of took over Hong Kong a solid 30 years, 25, 30 years before like the formal transfer of power was to have taken place in the late 2040s. So, I mean, that obviously augurs horribly for the fate of Taiwan. You kind of couple that with what's going on here. You couple that with what Ben is talking about with the China initiative, and obviously, a recurring leitmotif of the show, which is kind of just the way that the Fortune 500 and Wall Street and all kind of our financial elites are kind of just totally in bed with the Chinese Communist Party. My very black pill take on China is that I think it's only a matter of time before Xi Jinping actually sends the People's Liberation Army into Taiwan. I still think that we should be doing all that we reasonably and prudentially can to prevent that from happening. As on the show, we've talked about obviously kind of arming our allies in the region to the extent that they will allow us to do so. South Korea, Philippines, Japan, obviously, which has a unique history with respect to weaponry, and they are very reticent to kind of arm themselves up again for reasons that I don't find particularly persuasive, but I'm not Japanese, so I don't pretend to fully understand it. But my fairly black pill take, and I hope that I'm wrong on this, obviously, is that it's only a matter of time. And unfortunately, that would really be a bigger deal for a lot of reasons, honestly, than Russia kind of just waltzing into the Donbass, arguably even kind of just opposing Zelensky and taking Kiev. Because from a Taiwan perspective, I mean, forget about kind of like the actual geography of the islands. Taiwan Semiconductor is there. And Taiwan Semiconductor, if I'm not mistaken, is a plurality of US semiconductors, US chips. And you kind of add that up with kind of mainland China's already kind of outsized influence and presence in that space. I mean, we're getting really dicey there, guys, about kind of the way that China can kind of hold that very sophisticated and militarily sensitive weaponry over our head there. So I really pray that I'm wrong. But we're a little kind of straying off the course at this point. But anyway, all these segments kind of float together is kind of the point that I'm trying to make here, I guess.
Well, and speaking of that point, and speaking of presidents saying one thing and doing another, and using sort of superficial signaling to pass different, more radical and less popular agendas, my segment is going to be focused on Joe Biden's State of the Union address as one of the first big events for the Democratic Party to signal their tone in this election cycle post Glenn Youngkin. And I really do mean to say post Glenn Youngkin, but it's also post all of these recalls, school board recalls that we've seen. CNN recognizing with under new leadership that they need to change their brand and be less radically cultural leftist. There's been what feels like small, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? You can sort of see the earthquake coming, and maybe it's Youngkin. We'll look back and realize Youngkin was the earthquake, but we really see the Democratic Party starting to understand that tying itself obsessively to radical cultural leftism was not the wisest tactical decision. Joe Biden gave what Chris Hayes described repeatedly as a meat and potatoes speech on MSNBC after it was over. Joy Reid was like, wow, it was really, Biden is a guy you're not going to get the red meat from. And yet he managed to refer to abortion as healthcare. He called on Congress to to pass the Equality Act. He talked in fairly radical terms about transgender rights. And it all goes to show he can say fund the police as much as he wants and in as strong terms as he wants. But the Democratic Party has now dug itself so deeply into this hole of radical cultural leftism that a generation of journalists and activists and people on the left in this sort of vocal minority in its base demand nothing less. And when you spend years inflating the definitions of bigotry to mean one thing when the rest of the country sees it as another, you're going to have a really difficult time backtracking because you're on the record repeatedly saying that, you know, funding the police is tantamount to bigotry. And so it's true that the State of the Union address really was meant for, you know, de-leaning people in the middle who have been disillusioned with the Biden presidency. And that's exactly, you know, it wasn't for the journalist class that was breathlessly tweeting about it, but that's exactly why it's a useful sort of glimpse into how Democrats are trying to rhetorically and symbolically shift the culture war that they've been waging to the back burner. They want it to seem like an afterthought, but they will still be waging it because they can't not continue to wage it. They really put themselves in a difficult situation. And before I punt to the group, I'll just say I have no doubts that the media is going to help them whitewash their record and pretend that none of this happened. Of course, they're going to do that. But I still think it's going to be very difficult because of the growth of independent media and because of the base for Democrats to really meaningfully shift. So with that, I'll open it up to the group. Did you guys see the speech in a similar sort of vein? And do you see the Democratic Party in a similar type of pickle?
I mean, to your point about like whitewashing their record, I think that's exactly what's going on, right? They're trying to pretend that, even to the point where Joe Biden was like, no, we need to fund the police, as if his own party like hadn't been saying defund the police for the last like 2 straight years. But even like outside of the speech, from just a COVID policy standpoint, it was just infuriating how the fact that, you know, a day before or 2 days before the speech, Joe Biden was walking alone on the White House lawn wearing a mask. And because suddenly, conveniently, the science changed just in time for his speech, he was, you know, in a crowded chamber without a mask, like weirdly headbutting people when he was talking to them after the speech. And Nancy Pelosi, same thing. You know, the day before, she had been fining House Republicans $500 for every mask violation, and then suddenly it was fine. So there has definitely been a pivot. And I guess the question is like, are the voters, you know, going to fall for it? Because they clearly think voters are stupid enough to do so, that they're going to ignore, like, don't believe your lying eyes, don't believe reality, don't believe the clip montages that you see everywhere of Democrats making this point. And I just really think it's shameless. You know, you can't, a more authentic and I think a real way of handling it, because I think they do need to make the shift, is to acknowledge the fact that they did say it and they were wrong and it didn't work. But, you know, the arrogance and hubris in politics never allows for that. So, well, I guess we just have to wait and see, because I do think you're right, though, that the progressive left will not be satiated. The journalist class will not be satiated. So that element of it will continue, and Joe Biden will either continue to be pulled along by it, or he'll actually have to take a firmer hand.
Yeah, I mean, my biggest takeaway from the speech last night, which, you know, I unfortunately watched every minute of, was just the total disconnect between the message that he attempted to convey to the American people and where he is sitting in current polling. I mean, his approval ratings are historically terrible right now. I mean, we're talking like 35 to 40% approval ratings here. I mean, you know, the RD generic ballot this fall is showing unprecedented landslides for the GOP. I mean, if you buy the polling, and, you know, obviously the polling has historically been wrong over the past 5-10 years, but it's usually been wrong in a Democrat direction. So when they're predicting kind of Republican majorities of this magnitude, I mean, take with a grain of salt, obviously, but it's looking pretty good for the Republican Party this fall. I mean, you know, I saw Henry Olsen kind of break it down and say, if you kind of take this and you take that and you kind of transpose it and you kind of extrapolate, then the Republican Party could potentially be looking at congressional majorities, the likes of which that it has not seen since the Calvin Coolidge presidency about 100 years ago. So, you know, you take that and you compare it with what we heard last night, and it's just like, what is going on there? Because he obviously did a lot of happy talk about like Western superiority vis-a-vis Russia, obviously like the Ukrainian ambassador and kind of like this kind of kumbaya stuff. But the point is, like, if you are trailing in the polls as badly as Biden and his party are trailing, excuse me, at this point, then the onus is really on you to kind of go into like the halftime locker room, proverbially speaking, and change your game plan. I mean, you've got to like really kind of change course. You got to change direction. I heard absolutely nothing like that last night whatsoever. And to the extent that he had kind of major applause lines, it seemed to me like they were applause lines, that he's been literally on the other side of the issue on for the past like year and a half, 2 years, whether it's kind of slowly emerging from COVID hysteria, whether it's funding the police, not defunding the police, obviously. I mean, I guess kudos that he's saying that. I mean, let's give him a modicum of credit where I suppose he deserves it. But the rhetoric from Biden and Harris going back to the 2020 campaign on Black Lives Matter and defund the police stuff was horrific. It was abhorrent. I mean, Kamala Harris was literally talking about obviously funding the riots in Kenosha and stuff like that, right? So I think the American people are smart and savvy enough to really just see through this, to see through the outrageous notion that masking in Congress was completely required, lest you be fined as recently as like a week or two ago. And now apparently it's like totally fine and kosher to just like, symbolically, performatively social distance, but like kind of team up together. As a friend messaged me last night, by the way, look at the Supreme Court justices that were there. Wasn't it just like a few weeks ago that we had like a mini like contrived controversy from Nina Tottenberg, if I recall, about like Gorsuch and Sotomayor and like masking at the court? And then they were there like last night during the State of the Union, just totally unmasked. So I think the median American is savvy enough to see right through this charade. And it really was just a charade to me at the end of the day.
And also, by the way, if there were more protests over social justice, there's no way that Joe Biden in the midst of that would come out and say, we need to fund the police and we can all agree on that. It was just an easy line last night.
Totally.
Yeah, I mean, I thought this was a perfect illustration of ruling class theater. Frankly, I just felt such contempt for, on every single level, the disingenuous, staged nature of what transpired last night. And I have to believe that most Americans also have a similar kind of visceral reaction when they see this, although people who are not engaged in this on a day-to-day basis perhaps could be fooled by the calls for unity and the like. I hope and pray they're not. I mean, lest we forget, this is someone who's called basically half the country insurrectionists, neo-Confederates, neo-Klansmen, your Bull Connor, if you believe in voter ID, among the unvaccinated, unwashed masses, that you can expect a dark winter of death, et cetera. We know all of the ways in which he has maligned and smeared tens of millions of Americans throughout his presidency. One of my takeaways from last night is that the speech was sort of, to the extent it held together in any way, a self-own. Like, what were the kind of three pseudo applause lines, I guess? Back to school, police the streets, and defend the border. The things that he has been completely MIA on, of course. He's not going to triangulate in any way, of course, because the actual policy items that he laid out are just more of the same. And I think what you get is that question of, are you better off than you were a year ago? I don't know how any Americans, and of course the polling demonstrates this, a clear majority of Americans disagree with that. This was a speech that, from my perspective, showed America will get weaker, poorer, less secure, less peaceful at home and abroad. But the president spoke really strongly about liberty and independence for Ukraine, far less so for the American people. And that was kind of disturbing. I thought, last but not least, besides the repudiation of his own agenda in this speech, worth noting again that while he was talking about, standing up with Ukraine, once again, he talked about the green energy agenda, which is precisely what empowers Vladimir Putin. Both the Greens in Europe and the Greens in America, who have pushed an anti-energy unleashing agenda, which of course accrues to the benefit of Vladimir Putin. I guess if I had one silver lining from that speech, beyond the fact that, thankfully, or maybe not, the president is sort of a non-entity in almost every single way, and it's really the deep state that's driving things. So his lack of coherence, maybe it doesn't matter that much in the final analysis, although who knows at the end of the day who's actually calling the shots. But I think I would say I was pleasantly surprised that he did not go all in on the rhetoric of insurrection, the insurrection narrative. And I think that's telling. That might mean that the Democrats realize that it doesn't wash to call half the country anti-democratic putschists, I guess would be the term for it. So kudos to the president for not leaning into the false insurrection narrative and further smearing and maligning tens of millions of us deplorables.
Joy Reid was sort of lamenting the absence of January 6th from his speech on MSNBC afterwards. And Nicole Wallace chimed in to say, well, maybe, the president just didn't want to divide the chamber with that rhetoric. So yeah, maybe Ben is right there. They're sort of starting to wake up. I'm a little bit scared to toss this next subject to Rachel, because I feel like she's just going to devour it and shred the Republican Party, leave it in tatters.
Well, we'll see. I actually wanted to return to this issue of that we actually discussed on this podcast, I think a couple of weeks ago. Inez was with us at the time, Emily. And it was this idea that of McConnell, Senator Mitch McConnell, coming out and saying, we're not going to have an agenda running into the 2022 midterms. Our agenda is that Democrats are terrible, and that's it. Sorry, that's all you're getting. And I wrote a whole essay about this in the Federalist about why I actually think that's a strategically bad idea. I mean, I understand there's a rational element to it in the sense that, when your enemy's committing suicide, you don't stop him. But polling suggests that, Democrats are flocking to the Republican side because of the cultural overreaches of the Democratic Party, all the things that we constantly talk about. But in many cases, these are not traditional Republicans. And so if you actually are going to expand the base, you're going to keep these voters, you have to tell them what you're going to do. And you have to be very clear about how you're going to address the issues that are plaguing them. So there is obviously a vacuum here from the Senate Republican leadership, and conservatives, have long said someone needs to step into this breach. Well, Senator Rick Scott from Florida actually did. He saw McConnell's non-agenda and he said, no, I will write my own. And he released a 60-page, 11-point agenda that he thinks, if Republicans take back the majority in the Senate, should sort of outline how they govern. Now, you can agree or disagree with the substance of that agenda. There's a lot in there, and it covers everything from sort of the economic plights of the country all the way down to the cultural issues that are fomenting a lot of the Republican base. But the fact that he did something, I think, is significant here, because not only that he actually did something, and that's the leadership I think a lot of Republicans have been looking for, but the way that his own Republican leadership, McConnell and Thune, the minority whip, have responded to him, which is to say they have savaged him completely. As soon as this agenda was released, you had reports in Politico, which I call the burn book of Washington, basically reporting on closed door meetings where McConnell and his allies were savaging Rick Scott for even doing this, for having the gall to do it. And then you had a press conference right after that meeting where McConnell was asked about Scott's agenda. And the first thing he had to say was, well, if we take back the majority, I will be the majority leader. Okay, right? Like, if you have to say it out loud, maybe you're feeling a little insecure. And also, it's not a guarantee, right? He has to be elected in a conference-wide election that occurs after the midterms. But I think it just goes to show. Rachel, sorry, go ahead.
You should clarify for the gentleman that Burn Book is a Mean Girls reference.
Yes.
And Mitch McConnell is Regina George here.
The movie I return to explain Washington constantly is Mean Girls. Everybody thinks it's West Wing or House of Cards. It's not. It's basically high school tweens like kicking the crap out of each other. That is Washington. And Mitch McConnell is the head plastic. Regina George, for exactly instances like this, where this isn't legislative genius, this isn't, sort of calculation or arm twisting. This is bullying. And anyone who challenges the establishment narrative, anyone who is perceived to challenge the current status quo of power in Washington is treated like garbage. And again, this is not legislative maneuvering. This is just being a mean girl. And that's exactly what's going on here. And again, I come back to the idea that, like, you can agree or disagree with the substance. There's a lot in this agenda, and I applaud them for actually thinking through it and not just putting out like 5 bullet points. They put out 11 in 60 pages. But the point is that he stood up and did something. And for the conservative movement that's been asking for kind of new leadership, for people to actually aggress and step into this vacuum, he should be applauded for that. And the fact that McConnell is tearing him down, I am always interested in who the establishment goes after and why. And in this case, it is because their power base is being threatened. So good for Rick Scott. There's plenty of things that you can agree or disagree with what he's put out, but good for him for having the courage to do it. And I'll throw it open to the group for that.
I was going to say, I was talking to Rachel about this earlier. I love her take on this because I read Rick Scott's agenda and I thought a lot of it was just sort of, it was very boilerplate, and it didn't show me that the party had shifted exactly as much as it probably should on these issues. I thought some of it was a little tonally off, but I hadn't thought of it in terms of, in the terms that Rachel just put it, which are probably, that is the main takeaway. The main takeaway from the agenda isn't probably, it probably actually is not the substance. It's the move that Rick Scott made to fill the vacuum that Mitch McConnell has left. And on terms of agenda and on terms of substance, Mitch McConnell's agenda has been power. That's what his sort of, the substance of Mitch McConnell's speakership is power, through judges, particularly through judges, and through all of those other maneuvers where you see Cocaine Mitch, as his people like to call him. It's about power. That's what he's focused on. And so I think it's extremely interesting to see somebody like Rick Scott, who's interested in leadership, position himself this way by trying to position himself as a leader on substance, putting something out to say, this is what Senate Republicans would want an agenda to look like, and have an agenda. To do that, it just is extremely important. And I think it's fantastic that Rachel pointed it out, because I was sort of falling into the groupthink of like, okay, we went through this on Twitter, it's okay. But actually there's something much, much deeper in the works with what Rick Scott is doing here. And I'm curious if other Senate Republicans sort of pick up on his lead and are now emboldened to kind of stand up to McConnell in similar ways.
So, first of all, I have to object that I need to be kind of woman-splained Mean Girls to me. For the record, I thoroughly enjoyed the film when I saw it. When did that come out? Back in like 05, 06, something like that.
It was 2004. Yeah.
2004. Okay, yeah.
It's not a film, Josh. It's a documentary about Washington.
Okay. I've misspoken. I apologize. No, I genuinely remember enjoying it, actually, for whatever that's worth. Look, I mean, it seems to me like that this obviously is just crass bullying for the sake of bullying. We've dunked on Mitch McConnell a number of times on this podcast, as a podcast that features Rachel Bovard as a co-host is wont to do. He certainly deserves much of the scorn, perhaps all of it that we give him. Look, I also flipped through Rick Scott's thing. I mean, it's not necessarily like the most like avant-garde, cutting-edge proposal in the world. I mean, he's not kind of calling for like nationalization of big tech companies. He's not calling really for anything particularly kind of draconian or kind of paradigm shifting here. There was certainly some good rhetoric about using congressional power on abortion that I thought was kind of like a little outside of like the normie status quo. We saw some like Bill Kristol and some of his types that were kind of criticizing Rick Scott on these grounds, which says way more about Bill Kristol than it does about anything else, obviously. But I guess I'll make a very basic point, which is I literally don't understand what is so bad about saying what you are for. I mean, I understand, like, to kind of go back what I was saying on the previous segment. I mean, the polls are are showing historic Republican landslides this fall, showing kind of Calvin Coolidge era congressional majorities for the GOP come next January. I understand that, but that doesn't mean, especially kind of given all kind of the intellectual ferment that the Trump administration years brought, that doesn't mean that there isn't an onus to kind of take where we are and push the ball forward. And again, like Rick Scott's proposal here, and flipping through it, is a very, very, very modest way to try to do that. It is not a cutting edge document. So the notion that a party leader like McConnell could kind of muster up animus towards this just strikes me as just odd. And I agree that it really is not explainable for any other paradigm other than kind of just catty teenage girls. Honestly, that seems to me like that's basically right.
Well, I'll spare you and the audience my critique of Mean Girls. Although full disclosure, I thoroughly enjoyed it. However, too many times I've seen it as well. But I will say, I think that Rachel's point is really well taken. It's a shrewd rule of politics. Look to whom the establishment is attacking, and that will provide great insight into the inner workings that you might not otherwise see. And in this case, I think it's very clear that they're attacking on the basis of the fact that he would dare step out of line and put out any plan, not even get into the merits of the plan itself. From my vantage point, totally agree when your opponent is hanging himself, let him. But that said, politics is a business that requires a vision and a message to actually galvanize your voters. It's not enough to say the other side is terrible. You have to tell the American people how you are going to protect them and fight back against the people inflicting terrible punishment upon them, and having an actual agenda to achieve it. No one should fear putting out an agenda like that. Now, again, whether it's that McConnell et al. Fear the agenda itself, or just the fact that someone would have the gall to do it, I think is debatable, and it seems more like the latter than the former. But I think content-free campaigns are ultimately losing campaigns. You may win some battles, but you're going to lose a war long term. You know what the left's vision is every single time. You know what their agenda items are going to be. When Republicans have been really successful, go back to the Contract for America, for example, in '94, they put out a compelling agenda. And I also think it's incumbent upon conservatives to put out an agenda, if for no other reason than to shift the Overton window on a whole slew of issues. Put out your most extreme guidepost and then lead people towards that vision, even if you're not going to get there fully. The other side is constantly shifting the Overton window. We ought to do the same. I'll repeat what I've said a million times on this show. What would, and granted, I mean, they're kind of declining, but what would Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer do in an equivalent situation? That's how we ought to think about politics as well.
So with that, to Josh's point, everything really did flow well through this episode, and let's keep it going by transitioning to final thoughts. Who wants to start us off?
All right. I mean, I'll start us off by kind of just going back to the Russia-Ukraine stuff, because I'm honestly having like a hard time thinking about anything else, probably because my Twitter feed and my cable news in the background, it's all they're talking about as well here. So look, I spent a lot of time at the beginning talking about kind of the rise of liberal internationalism, but I think it's kind of important here to emphasize that the so-called kind of American case for Vladimir Putin, I think, is vanishingly thin. I think saying that does not necessarily make one kind of like a Soros puppet or a neoliberal shill or anything like that. You got to understand who Vladimir Putin is. Okay, I mean, this is a guy who literally came up through the ranks of the KGB. He is a Cold Warrior to his bones. He has said time and time again that the dissolution of the Soviet Union is one of the great tragedies of modern history. I mean, I have no doubt whatsoever if he had his druthers that he would kind of bring back Belarus and Moldova and the Baltic states, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, all of them, that he would kind of resuscitate kind of the Soviet Union in all of its glory or inglory, as the case may be here. And, you know, it's important. We can kind of juxtapose Ukraine with its neighbor to the north, Belarus, where Lukashenko, rigs elections, literally rigs elections. And he is very much kind of just a Putin puppet. Belarus has said that they are actually kind of helping the Russian military in the assault on Kiev. And our allies in the region, from a U.S. national interest perspective, and that's obviously the only way to do foreign policy, we should be thinking about what our closest allies on the ground want. So, in this case, that kind of means kind of like the Visegrad states, right? Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and they are Baltic states in particular as well. And they are unified on this. This is not a close call. They are unified insofar as they want the Zelensky regime to stay in power, when on the other hand, he could be toppled for a Belarus-style Putin puppet. So it seems to me like that is clearly what we should be rooting for. Obviously, the means of doing so is where all this gets kind of nuanced and thorny. And obviously, we should be ruling out troops and no-fly zones and all this kind of crazy neocon, neoliberal crap. But when the choice becomes Putin or Zelensky, I just feel the need to underscore that I do not think that is a particularly close call. The close call comes obviously in kind of getting through the propaganda and kind of like the fog of war, and then obviously ultimately the means of doing so. But I just wanted to underscore that point as well.
Yeah, and I'll add. Okay, so sorry, Rachel. I was just going to say I think it was a Ukrainian woman who was interviewed on CNN, and she had picked up a gun and was fighting for her country, and said something about like how they're fighting for a new world order. It was her, maybe it was even like, I forget who it was. Anyway, someone said that. And the online right was like, wow, it's out in the open now. And I think it's interesting because new world order is a buzzword for sort of conspiracy theorists and everything, but it also is just like a phrase that has literal meaning. And like if you separate the buzzword connotation from it, it is true that right now what's happening, like Putin is intentionally trying to create a new world order, not in the conspiratorial sense, just in the literal sense of what that phrase means, where the West is weakened, and where sort of Russia and China have their empires and are resurgent in terms of their powers, and America is undercut, the EU and NATO are undercut, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a ton of nuance in there, but the black and white actually still remains. It actually still exists that, the West and America and our Republican system of government are better systems. And that order does protect. It actually hurts people in a whole lot of ways that we should correct and we should absolutely address. There's no way that we shouldn't. And this has come up with Brexit and Trump time and time again, but fundamentally does protect people and protects freedoms and liberties. And no matter how cliched and tired all of that sounds now in this time where we are all reasonably disillusioned, I do think there is, something vast at stake here. That doesn't mean we need troops on the ground and to enforce a no-fly zone. And I think it's been heartening to see the nuanced responses from people like Blake Masters, even Joe Biden himself, when you can understand the words he's saying in speeches. So it's all sort of playing out in an interesting way, but I think in a very, very important way. And I would just echo everything that Josh had already said.
Yeah, one of the sort of threads I was going to pull that I think flows through each of these segments, which is maybe a sort of side point to the one we've been talking about, but again, is this gulf on a lot of these issues between where the American people are and where their sort of elites are. And this is always the case with war. This is always the case with defense policy, especially with Ukraine. You have the traditional ways in which the US has responded to a lot of these conflicts. And then you have now, which if we take Emily's point, that we should be less cynical about this, right? There is some nuance being forced into the debate, which means, the sort of elite cabal, the defense cabal that makes these decisions away from them is being more forced to take into account how people actually feel about this conflict, not and take sort of the feelings out of it, right? In the sense that what should we do to support our interest, while also recognizing the interest we have in a free Ukraine. And that's a level of debate that really hasn't taken place before. And then, I think you also talk about Ben's segment, where you have this woke elite sort of take on espionage. Like that, again, is just this narrow cabal of people forcing their progressive view of the world onto our intelligence gathering capabilities, which we haven't talked really about how scary I think that is, because it's hilarious, but it's also very scary. And it doesn't reflect, again, the base of the country, I think, on these issues. And then, coming back around to sort of how, again, the ruling class here in Washington just doesn't have any interest in actually addressing the concerns of their base. They just want to take power for the sake of it, to a majority, to put it on a shelf and polish it. So I do think that, we can call it the post-Trump moment or whatever, but I do think there has been forced into the conversation a little bit more of this, like, you have to actually take these concerns seriously. The country's changing a lot of really key questions. And I think our politics is being more defined by that than it has been in a while. And I think that's a good thing. Uncharacteristic white pill.
I guess I'll say I hope that trend continues. I'm not sure if I'm sanguine or not about the situation, but I'll just put out there that every single day that goes on with Kiev still standing as independent of Vladimir Putin's Russia, and where Russia, it seems, is bogged down. Although, again, I don't really trust any news from any side that's being reported about the state of play. But every single day that goes by with Ukraine as an independent country, in whole or in part, I think is devastating for Putin. My assumption had always been that he would like to roll in as fast as possible, depose Zelensky and put in a puppet, and then have basically a proxy state just like a Belarus, because getting bogged down in an occupation and dealing with an insurgency would be disastrous on a lot of levels for Russia. My hope is that one way or the other, the Russians are bled dry in this drive to seize Ukraine. Let's see if it happens. Let's see what the U.S. can do at minimal cost to effectuate or to help the Ukrainians inflict maximal pain on the Russians, because I think that's what all of this comes down to, is how do you spend the least in terms of U.S. blood and treasure to achieve an interest. And of course, it's an interest to keep Ukraine out of the hands of Putin. period, full stop. Looking at sort of the broader picture in terms of potential silver linings in the situation, first of all, the security umbrella that we've provided to European powers, it's incumbent upon European powers, all of them, period, full stop, to themselves arm and be prepared for threats posed to them. And number two, this should be the death knell of the green agenda. This should lead to a massive renaissance in nuclear and other technologies in Europe and beyond, to have a bulwark against a regime like a Russia. You can't be dependent on a Russia or a China or an Iran or any of these kinds of powers for any essential goods, services, commodities. And any world that continues to persist under this illusion that, you know, we can counter these powers, but then we're going to be dependent upon China for our most vital medicines, or we're going to be dependent upon Russia for pumping out millions of barrels of oil a day. That's a disastrous paradigm to be engaging in. And I think, you know, one thing we ought to look at in terms of how we evaluate coherence or lack thereof of this administration's policies is that there is a burgeoning China, Russia, Iran axis. And of course, the rogue powers always kind of partner and ally. They want to split and divide the West. It serves their ends. They work together, even though, of course, they have their own internal differences. But there are actual, on paper, strategic agreements, decades-long strategic agreements in hugely significant sectors that have been agreed upon in recent years between Russia and Iran, between Russia and China, obviously, between China and Iran. That is the axis to watch. And so for there to be any coherence for this or any other administration, all policies need to be thought of in context of that burgeoning axis that, of course, opposes U.S. national interests and, of course, is dominated by communist China. Last point I'll make really briefly is Josh mentioned, you know, Taiwan, and obviously Xi Jinping's lust to seize it is probably what he thinks will be his crowning achievement. Michael Goodwin in the New York Post reported basically rumblings. He recently interviewed President Trump, rumblings that Trump had threatened Xi Jinping with attacking China to the extent Xi had made a move on Taiwan, and Vladimir Putin that he would attack Moscow to the extent Putin sought to seize Ukraine. In my own independent reporting, I have also heard these rumblings as well from people in the know. And I think if there's one kind of takeaway from it, it's that one person who threatens to rain annihilation down on powers for crossing certain red lines and who is perceived as credibly, potentially posing such a threat really can make the difference between a stable but dangerous world and a very unstable, dangerous world. And I think it's very clear that with the current occupant of the White House, that stability is gone. The next leader needs to pose a credible threat to inflict massive pain on any power who would cross red lines and actually prove it with their actions.
Well, on behalf of Ben, Rachel, and Josh, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Emily Jashinsky, and we will see you at the next NatCon Squad.